This is the story of the small village of Le Chambon in France. When strangers went to the French town of Le Chambon during World War II, they were in desperate need of hospitality. Those strangers were Jews fleeing to escape Hitler's death camps. Many people of the small town worked together to hide the refugees and help them cross the border into neutral Switzerland. They gave their hospitality at the risk of their lives. But some of the residents resisted the strangers and pleaded with their neighbours to refuse hospitality to them. Surprisingly, those opposed to welcoming them were Jews themselves. Rosemary Houghton describes the scene. When the second German Jewish refugee came to the presbytery, Magda Trocme went to the wife of a well-known French rabbi who was staying in Le Chambon at the time after having escaped from the occupied zone. Could not this Jewish connection help other Jews, Magda thought. The woman angrily refused. These refugees were German Jews, she said. It is because of the foreign Jews that our French Jews are being persecuted. They are responsible for our worries and difficulties. Sometimes strangers bring out the best in us, and sometimes the worst. Strangers help uncover the evil in us that is so familiar that it ceases to seem evil. But the reverse was also true. Many in the village gave help, and when asked why, they put it down to their pastor of the previous few years, who before the war had repeatedly talked of the central virtue of welcoming the stranger as though he or she were Jesus. This is the final podcast in our series looking at what's missing in modern discipleship. My name's Jools, this is Dchurched.com. Welcome. That French village had been shaped by the training of their pastor. Normative Christian behavior was viewed as welcoming the stranger. This was reinforced in the teaching and in the fact that the entire community made it a lifestyle. After a few years of doing this, it had become such a habit that it was now just reflexive to welcome strangers who, during the war years, just happened to be Jewish. They barely gave it a second thought, and it was unlike most of the other villages in their region. This is the bottom line of disciple making. Does it impact behavior when the pressure is on? I'm suggesting today two drivers that create such virtues: community-shaped habits of grace. Firstly, let's think about being community-shaped. In the early church, catechizing or training somebody to be a disciple took time. When somebody became a believer from out of an environment of paganism, it was always viewed as a slow process. It was accompanied by ongoing assessment, asking the question, is this person exhibiting the grace of Christ in their life? This slow process, if you like, is analogous with the experience of the Hebrew slaves. Somebody has said it took only a few days for the Hebrews to get out of Egypt, but 40 years to get Egypt out of them. There are no instant conversions. Even if we think of Paul on the Damascus road, he wasn't instantly converted. He had seen the grace of the persecuted Christians that he'd been torturing. And when he encountered Jesus, he then had to work out what it looked like to follow Jesus in the light of his Jewish theology. And the church were initially fearful. So Barnabas and probably others came alongside him for a year or two, probably told him the stories of Jesus, and he began to reshape his thinking about life and what it means. And as he began to rethink his theology, slowly his old ways of thinking began to change, and he was welcomed into the church. This process of change is echoed in the following centuries of the church. When someone began to take a serious interest in converting, the church knew that they should demonstrate fruit and the character of Christ before being baptized. Baptisms normally took place on Easter Sunday, and in the year or even 2 years prior, the would-be convert would be placed with a sponsor. The sponsor or catechizer would meet with them 3 or 4 times per week to teach them the sacred texts that were central to develop ways of thinking that were Christian. The catechizer's role was ultimately to assess whether this would-be convert had truly grasped what taking a cross and following Jesus meant. And all things being okay with the sponsor, the candidate would come to baptism on Easter Sunday, first having had all their demons cast out. That was standard practice too. This process of training and assessment was taken far more seriously than in churches today, even if it expressed itself in specific ways within that cultural context. They knew what sort of people the pagans were, and therefore what ways of thinking needed to be drummed out of them. And as I said in the last podcast, patience was at the heart of this change of values and thinking. This process was also reinforced by the community and how they would interact with one another, modeling patience, hospitality, and grace. In one sense, this was a form of socialization. The community acted in certain ways that gradually shaped newcomers. This was reinforced by the sponsor, who encouraged certain behaviors and who continued to assess whether grace was genuinely at work in the would-be convert's life. In the 21st century, it would be a rare thing to see such vigorous assessment before a person is declared to be a Christian worthy of baptism. Membership classes typically are a pale imitation of the catechizing process of the early church. Certainly there was no expectation of a close relationship of accountability or discipling. But I see hope. Numbers, particularly of a younger generation that I know, have what they call accountability groups. These hold great hope for the future of the church. There is a huge challenge overcoming the ways of thinking in our culture that I mentioned in the first podcast, things that work against discipleship. These have seeped into the church, and such ancient values that we're talking about fly in the face of Western individualism and privatized spirituality. But having honest and mutual groups that develop caring and provide nurturing accountability is definitely part of the answer. Community-shaped discipleship. And secondly, habits of grace. The ancient church had a term for the practices that would reinforce the values they were trying to imbue. Habitus is the Latin, habitus, from which of course we get the word habit. There are good habits and there are bad habits. Repeated actions for an athlete create muscle memory. Eventually the practice of an action becomes natural, although initially when we started it felt odd and alien. It becomes so part of who we are that to do anything other would feel counterintuitive to our identity. It's the same way we learnt to use a knife and fork. As a small child, it took time, but as an adult, we do it without thinking. When I learnt to use chopsticks while living in Korea, it took a lot of thinking to not have my meat or noodles fly across the table. But as time went by, it became easier. At times, I looked with envy at those who could use their chopsticks like scissors and even cut up meat with them. I didn't get to that standard, but I learnt to not end up covered in my dinner or to poke anyone's eye out with my ham-fisted technique with chopsticks. Some habits take a while to become natural, but are worth the effort, particularly if you don't want to go hungry. The habitus of the early church included regular memorization of sections of the Bible, practices of grace, such as not responding with anger, or being hospitable, or by developing patient waiting practices both with God and with others. These were specific embodied practices, not just theoretical theology. There was a sense in which God was at work within the individual, but the practices were the key component working from the outside in. Here's the thing, for Christianity to make a change to who we are, it is both an outside in and an inside out thing. God is at work within us, but it's also an outside in thing. External practices day in, day out. Habitus that become part of us. Habitus that become part of us. Within the church community, the values that were encouraged were those of patiently waiting on God, of not always being striving or self-asserting or feeling the need to prove themselves. Why? Because the Lord was their vindicator. There was no need to force the world to believe because God was in control. And this was not merely a kind of passive fatalism, but an active development of personal character traits, habits that were developed. They were on the front foot, knowing that the fruit of the Spirit needed to be consciously and proactively nurtured. So what have we said in all this? We've talked about how the early church emphasized patience as a key virtue and how that was formed by community shaping and habits of grace embodied in their lifestyles. This is what stands out to me as the distinctive disciple-making pattern of the early church. There are probably other factors too, but this is something that really strikes a chord with me as counterintuitive to the way it's often done in the modern Western church. Rome wasn't built in a day is our title for these podcasts, but that has a kind of double meaning to it. It says that discipleship is built slowly and carefully, and the impact may be over more than one lifetime and beyond the short-term losses caused by the loss of key leaders or apostles. However, the Roman takeover of church life by Constantine, when the president, as it were, got born again, had some good effects on church life in decreasing persecution. But it was also hugely detrimental for discipleship. When the empire took over the church, there was a gradual shift away from all three of these elements of discipleship in one way or another. Patience as a key virtue, community-shaped habits of grace ceased to be quite what they once were. Maybe it's time we think again about why the faith sometimes hasn't significantly changed who you are. It may be that at least part of the model of developing Christ-likeness hasn't been helpful. God hasn't zapped you and made you a better person because He needs us to connect with others in deep discipling relationships. And with that, to embed in our lives practices out in God's world that help shape us in His grace. To live a life in which the habits we have will lead us to be transformed into being more gracious and loving than we were a year ago. Disciples who walk in the path of the one who said, "My yoke is easy." How does it become easy? When we have habituated our thinking into responding in peaceful and gracious ways. Maybe when we do that, we will discover a fresh sense of being alive in Christ. It may take some time. It will take some time. But let's begin the journey into His wholeness. I'm Jools. This is Dchurched.com. Please join us on our Facebook page and don't forget to like this podcast.